Claudine Gay's out at Harvard. I'm Kevin Cirilli. It's time for the Daily Debrief, your one-stop shop for the news you need to know now. Let's get right to it. Big news. Claudine Gay is out at Harvard University. The now former Harvard University president has been plagued with plagiarism allegations, as well as bipartisan criticism for her handling of the testimony before Congress last month about anti-Semitism on Harvard's campus. Joining me now with the latest is the Hill's Brett Samuels. This isn't too much of a shocker, Brett.
Not at all, Kevin. Not if you've been sort of following the events, especially since that hearing that you mentioned on anti-Semitism, where Claudine Gay, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, and these Ivy League leaders were on the Hill and were basically grilled over their handling of anti-Semitism on campus. They all sort of drew the ire, especially of conservatives, but also of some Democrats when they sort of refused to unequivocally condemn calls for genocide on campus of Jews. And that has led to really this sort of rallying cry among conservatives in particular, calling for Claudine Gay's ouster and the ouster of these other presidents. And here we are a few weeks later, she's out at Harvard.
The White House also joined the criticism of her testimony on that hearing of anti-Semitism. Elise Stefanik, the New York Republican, already tweeting out 2 down, 1 to go as a result of Claudine Gay's resignation. Liz McGill, the now former president from the University of Pennsylvania, of course, was the first university president to be ousted. Now, the one remaining individual who testified at that hearing, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT President Sally Kornbluth, is still in a job. It's interesting to note the journey, so to speak, that Claudine Gay at Harvard took. I mean, this is the shortest tenure for a university president of Harvard ever. She only lasted like 6.5 months. You had prominent donors saying that they were going to be withdrawing donations. You had Bill Ackman, a hedge fund guy, coming out and raising serious concerns about plagiarism after the Harvard Corporation defended her following her remarks before the testimony that she gave on anti-Semitism. And again, the pushback was just so intense coming from Democrats, like even Senator Kirsten Gillibrand had called on her to resign. This was not just Republicans, but for the Harvard Corporation to stand by her, Brett, at a time when you have Congresswoman Stefanik saying that she's launching an investigation into these universities, and oh yeah, they're going to use subpoena power. If you're the Harvard Corporation, which positions itself as the oldest corporation, not just in the United States, but of the Western Hemisphere, they're going to be digging through their financial records, are they not? And not just their financial records here in the United States, but internationally, specifically with China.
Yeah, Kevin, it just goes to show, I think, how much of a cause essentially this became on the right, especially in the aftermath of that anti-Semitism hearing. You mentioned Elise Stefanik. This was sort of a star turn for her, as she was the lawmaker who was questioning these university presidents that spurred these resignations, as you mentioned, at Harvard and at Penn as well. And now you have Bill Ackman, as you mentioned, is sort of on social media almost daily, it seems, trying to draw attention to these things. So it just underscores, I think, the degree to which, you already had conservatives who I think were looking to investigate or probe sort of the dealings of some of these Ivy League universities with what they perceived as sort of left-leaning biases. But now in the wake of that anti-Semitism hearing, that really just ratcheted up. And now you have 2 university presidents resigned, a call for a third one still to be ousted. And as you said, I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see investigations or calls for investigations into these schools' dealings.
Well, based on your reporting, specifically with regards to this, how did it go from partisanship to nonpartisanship? Because this crossed a threshold when you have Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a Democrat from New York, going on Fox News and saying that these 3 university presidents have to go. When you have Congressman Richie Torres, Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, a progressive by all accounts, calling on these university leaders to get out of, to resign for their remarks. And when you have the White House, Karine Jean-Pierre criticizing Claudine Gay, criticizing Sally Kornbluth, criticizing now former UPenn president Liz McGill, This was a nonpartisan area, was it not?
Yeah, you certainly had a few holdouts on the left in particular, but that I think this is emblematic of sort of the broader breakdown of where folks have fallen on the issue of Israel and its war with Hamas ever since the attacks in October that left about 1,200 Israelis dead. We've seen these sort of similar, where people have fallen essentially on this issue in the aftermath of those attacks in terms of what Israel should be allowed to do, whether there should be more support for Gaza and Palestinians. It's very similar, I think, when you look at folks like John Fetterman, you mentioned, who are perceived to be more progressive, still aligning themselves with Israel, saying we should support Israel. The White House, as you mentioned, Karine Jean-Pierre said at a briefing I was at, essentially pushing back on Rashida Tlaib, a progressive congresswoman, and sort of some of her comments. So this issue with the Ivy League presidents, I think, is just emblematic of sort of the fault lines we've seen develop in the Israel-Hamas conflict more broadly in the last couple of months.
And kudos, by the way, to the Harvard Crimson and those student journalists who were really out ahead. I mean, they beat us, Brett. They beat the national media. They beat us old guys at this, but it was a massive scoop for them. Excellent reporting from those student journalists, and they were all over this and really capturing. You cannot be a university president of Harvard, nonetheless. I didn't go to Harvard, by the way. You cannot be a university president and plagiarize. You just can't do it. Brett, don't go anywhere. Stay right there, because obviously now I want to talk about everything going on this month with politics. And speaking of that, let's go now to the Decision Desk 2024, where we are carefully tracking the latest polling and analysis from the campaign trail. And the trail, as they say, it could run directly through the Supreme Court of the United States as early as this month. Hear me out. Donald Trump, the former president of the United States and the current frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination, he's barred from being on the ballot in 2 states, Colorado and Maine, where officials have argued that he broke the insurrectionist clause in the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment. Now, Trump is set to appeal the decisions, and I spoke with a source close to Trump's legal team just before coming on air today, and they are ready for a battle for one of the most consequential political election rulings since the 2000 Bush v. Gore decision. Remember the hanging chads? The source I spoke with said that SCOTUS will likely have to rule on Colorado first, and there's 3 things to know. First, a SCOTUS announcement that they're taking up the case would freeze all of the efforts of states working on similar cases moving forward. So the second SCOTUS says that they're going to take up this case, everything else as it relates to the insurrectionist clause is put on pause. Second, the general thinking in Trump world is that the Supreme Court must rule before around early February, because Colorado is set to hold their primary on Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday is March 5th. So what that means is that Colorado election officials have to begin printing ballots several weeks before. You have to remember, it takes weeks and weeks to print out ballots and to organize a primary election. So the Supreme Court wants to have their ruling before that takes place. Lastly, despite what you may have heard or read elsewhere, based on my own reporting, Trump world is not nervous whatsoever that DJT will be kept off the ballot in any states. To dive into the weeds, the Trump source told me that SCOTUS could make their decision based on several different legalities, including, but not limited to, whether A, the 14th Amendment applies to a president at all, B, whether the Constitution requires for someone to be charged with insurrection before being found to violate the 14th Amendment, and C, that it's simply way too close to an election, in this case, weeks before a primary election, for state officials to bring any type of item forward that would bar a candidate from being on the ballot. So I want to bring back into the conversation The Hill's Brett Samuels, who covers the White House for us here at The Hill. Brett, Democrats around the country have said that Trump should be on the ballot. Does President Biden himself need to take a position on this?
Well, Kevin, so far, from what I've heard from Democrats, from the White House, is that there's not really a sense of urgency or a great sense of pressure for President Biden to weigh in on the actual legal matter at hand. And part of that is because when we last heard the president weigh in on this before the holiday, he essentially said, that he didn't want to weigh in on the court case, that the Supreme Court would handle this on appeal, but that Biden said that he believes Trump is an insurrectionist and that is self-evident. So I think part of the reason folks don't think there's this great sense of urgency for Biden to weigh in on the case itself is because his thoughts on the matter at the crux of this, of whether Trump, is an insurrectionist, Biden's made that pretty clear himself.
I still can't believe that we're only a few days now away from the Iowa caucus. And I want to dive into the decision desk crosstabs, where Nikki Haley is out with an ad today attacking Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for ties to China. But when you look at the polling out of Iowa, she is at 17.1% within striking distance of DeSantis, who's at 18%. And of course, Trump remains the dominant frontrunner. Can Haley break through with her closing argument in the Hawkeye state to surpass DeSantis?
That's, I think, what most people will be watching is in many ways kind of who finishes second behind Donald Trump. And when I talk to political strategists in Iowa, Republican operatives, they like to say that in Iowa with these caucuses, a lot can change in just the final few days, really, even. So as you mentioned, we're under 2 weeks away from the caucuses. So certainly there's a lot still to be decided. And Nikki Haley and her allies are out with these ads, are attacking DeSantis. So clearly they see an opening for the former South Carolina governor to make a big push here and maybe build some momentum going into New Hampshire, even if she's not able to overtake Donald Trump, who seems like the clear runaway frontrunner at this point.
Well, and I peeked at my inbox before I got on air, and she's also now attacking Trump. She's saying that Trump's hiding by not showing up to the CNN debate and town halls that are coming up. But Trump, meanwhile, just announced that he's going to be holding an Iowa town hall on Fox News, so some counter programming. And when you look specifically at the Granite State, at the decision desk, New Hampshire polling, you also have Trump leading at 43.7%. Haley still beating Christie and DeSantis there with 26.7%. But who drops out after Iowa, after New Hampshire, and how does that change the dynamics of the race, if at all, for the Republican nomination?
Yeah, I think that's, sort of one of the big questions really throughout this whole primary has been who will drop out? When will they drop out? Will people sort of coalesce behind a Trump alternative? And after New Hampshire, I think that's going to be a big sort of sticking point. Christie will be one to watch because he's really put a lot of basically all his resources, frankly, into New Hampshire. So if we don't see a strong showing from him there, he'll be one to watch. And Ron DeSantis will be, I think, the big one to watch, where if he finishes behind Nikki Haley in both Iowa and New Hampshire, there will be, I think, a lot of pressure on him to drop out. But the question then is, do DeSantis backers go and support Haley, or do a good chunk of them just go back to Trump and say that, he's the closest thing to DeSantis, we'll just go back to the former president?
I think Trump world thinks they're going to get a DeSantis backing and an endorsement shortly after he would drop out. Brett Samuels, breaking down so many headlines, so plugged in. You are the zeitgeist, my friend, of everything happening in the political orbit. Thank you for your excellent reporting.
Thanks, Kevin.
House Speaker Mike Johnson and GOP colleagues are heading to the border this week to get a firsthand look at the migrant crisis. There were more than 250,000, 302,000 to be exact, migrant crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border in the month of December alone, according to Customs and Border Patrol officials. That is the highest number of crossings in more than 2 decades.
We have 1.7 million people who are ready to be deported, but they just won't deport them. We need to send some people out of the country to stop the inflow. But Title 42 authority in the hands of any administration willing to use it would stop this. When you come to our border, we say, I'm sorry, we're full.
Even progressives are calling for action. Democratic Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman doubled down in an interview with Semaphore that backing border security is not xenophobic. Meanwhile, Texas Governor Greg Abbott is taking matters into his own hands, pledging $1.54 billion of state money to continue building border barriers. Abbott is also busing migrants from the border to Democratic-led cities like Chicago and New York. New York Mayor Eric Adams says that Abbott's busing policy is creating chaos in the Big Apple. Adams now is requiring bus companies transporting migrants to give the city a 32-hour notice before arriving. Israel is set to remove thousands of soldiers from Gaza beginning this week as it enters a new phase of its war against the terror group Hamas. Analysts are now saying that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is slowly shifting to a low-intensity phase of the war, which Palestinian officials say has already killed more than 20,000. There's been growing international pressure on Netanyahu, including from staunch allies of Israel, about how his longer-term plan for the war is being navigated. And in Israel, the Israel Supreme Court struck down a key portion of Netanyahu's judicial overhaul that stripped the court's ability to declare government decisions as unreasonable. In the ruling, the court said that Netanyahu's policies would have been a severe blow to the state of Israel as a democratic state. Meanwhile, back here in the United States, Secretary of State Antony Blinken approved $147.5 million in emergency funding for Israeli Defense Forces. He was able to bypass Congress as talks remain stalled for supplemental aid during congressional recess. Elsewhere, there's still a risk of the Israel-Hamas war spreading further into the Middle East. Iran has sent a massive warship into the Red Sea. And U.S. forces struck and sunk 3 Houthi boats that were attacking merchant ships in the Red Sea, which is an incredibly vital global trade route. The unsealing of pedophile Jeffrey Epstein's bombshell list of associates is imminent. The big name to watch is former President Bill Clinton, who was reportedly mentioned several times as one of the more than 200 prominent names listed in the currently sealed documents. But this does not mean that new charges will be filed against anyone including former President Clinton. And many of the people on the list have been accused or have not been accused. This is important. Many of the people on the list have not been accused of any legal wrongdoing. But what these documents do is shed light on the personal relationships prominent people had with Epstein and the extent of their visits to his notorious island. Mickey Mouse is about to become your worst nightmare. Disney's copyright on the 1928 Steamboat Willie version of the character has ended, and early versions of the world's most famous mouse have become public domain. So what does that actually mean? Well, for starters, it means a new British indie slasher film is coming. Mickey's Mouse Trap, similar to 2023's Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, will feature a demented killer masked as Mickey terrorizing theaters near you. Thankfully, and truly folks, thankfully, the copyright for the more modern versions of Mickey remain in place, so modern Mickey will continue his reign as the planet's most beloved mouse. Please just do not mess with Donald Duck. I mean, I am not going to go see the Mickey Mouse slasher movie. That's horrifying. Horrifying. That's it for today's daily debrief. If you are going to see the Mickey Mouse horror flick, let me know in the comments. My name's Kevin Cirilli. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.